Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. We are joining you today from the shared territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations at Oh Boy Productions. Thank you for joining us this afternoon to kick off the 2021 Fall Assembly. As the world continues to grapple with the COVID-19 pandemic, we are happy to bring this event to you in a virtual format for the second year. We are broadcasting from all over British Columbia, with speakers joining from online, from the studio, and in pre-recorded sessions. You can also use Slido throughout the day to let us know where you're joining from. The main thread in this assembly will continue to keep us focused on the status of Pacific salmon. You will hear about governance structures that facilitate fisheries management decision-making, the importance of a cohesive First Nations voice, and a united approach to managing Pacific salmon. As our teaching and our practices show us, just like in our songs, cohesive voices and actions make us stronger together. One heart and one mind, we are all connected. For the opening, I would like to now introduce you to the singers today from the Coastal Wolfpack, a three-generation family group of Coast Salish singers, drummers, and dancers that you may have seen performing at other events.
I'm honored to have me and my family welcome you to the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish unceded territory. And it's an honor for us to sing the Women's Gathering Song today.
we send our thanks to the Coastal Wolfpack for their wonderful opening to our assembly. As we move into the key topics, we would now like to ask the First Nations Fisheries Council President Hugh to start us off in a good way and provide opening remarks. He will now present you with a message on behalf of the regional delegates. Thanks. Hugh.
Thank you very much. Firstly, on behalf of the Executive and the Council of the First Nations Fisheries Council, I want to thank you all for attending today and to welcome you to our annual assembly. The First Nations Fishery Council only succeeds because of you. Your participation and your input into the Fisheries Council is vital to the work that we do. So I encourage each of you to continue your support by getting involved in Fisheries Council matters. I encourage you to visit the website for the First Nations Fisheries Council. And on that website, you'll see a listing of upcoming events. So for example, the Fisheries Council is active in such areas as diverse as the federal efforts to save the southern killer whale population, marine traffic on the west coast of BC, and a multitude of other initiatives. Some of them are funded if you have people attending by Zoom from home. So please check our website, check the upcoming events, and if they interest you at all, give the FNFC a call and become involved in those matters. Remember, it only succeeds because of you. Over the past couple of days, I've been watching the media reports on the global climate change conference that's happening in Glasgow. This has reminded me that issues with respect to many of the fish species on the coast of British Columbia, particularly salmon, are extremely complex. As people, we have a tendency to just look for one thing to blame, like overlogging, or perhaps overfishing, or something like that, or perhaps climate change. But over the past few days, we've come to learn that matters are far more complex than that, and it requires the FNFC to look into a multitude of issues. We have ongoing efforts to meet with the provincial and federal government to discuss reconciliation with respect to fisheries. The legislative declaration by the province a couple of years ago, implementing UNDRIP into government policies with respect to fisheries and other issues. Recently, we had a meeting with, I believe it was somewhere between 13 and 14 assistant deputy ministers from British Columbia. That's an example of the type of meetings that the FNFC will try and continue to have, so that we have a high-level discussion on how to resolve some of those issues. We want to work together, not in opposition, and we need your help and your support to attend our meetings and put your input into the workshops that we sponsor periodically so that we bring the right message back to government. The Pacific Salmon Strategy initiative by the government is a complicated one. It's one that we are working with on a trilateral process. It's one that we want to try and reach out to you on so that you get your input into where the salmon initiative by the federal government is going. And we want to make sure that the correct path is taken by the government, a path that reflects Aboriginal people. As I've watched the Glasgow conference on climate change, I've been dismayed by how little attention has been made to Indigenous people. I've been dismayed by how little input they have had. So we don't want that type of action to follow when it comes to fish, particularly salmon on the west coast of Canada. Salmon are vital. They're a pillar for most of the coastal First Nations culture, traditions, and way of life. And we want to make sure that our voice is a strong one when the government develops the policies. So welcome again. We're happy that you're all here. We're looking forward to your questions over the next 3 days and your involvement in our annual assembly. Hopefully next year, COVID will be behind us and we'll have an in-person meeting. Unfortunately, we couldn't do it this year. As you all know, COVID is still very strong, particularly in the north of BC. But hopefully next year, this is behind us and we can all get together in person, sit around tables and discuss these policies that are vital to our concern. Thank you all very much.
Claco, Hugh. In light of the reconciliation environment, First Nations throughout BC are increasingly influencing the direction of case law, governance, policies and programs to strengthen outcomes for fisheries, aquatic resources, and habitats, both with their within their individual territories and collectively across British Columbia. This requires strong leaders and advocates. One such leader is with us today. It gives us great pleasure to introduce this iconic leader who is no stranger to anyone in Canada. Today, we are honored to hear from Jody Wilson-Raybould Poglas and First Nations Fisheries Council Executive Director Jordan Point. Together, they will be discussing her recent experiences. As many of you are aware, Jody served as Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada. A proud member of Wiwikai Nation, Jody has held the post of Regional Chief in the British Columbia Assembly of First Nations and other posts. She will share her experiences in government, reflections on her recently published book, Indian in the Cabinet, and discuss where her continued interest in the advancement of Indigenous governance may lead. I will now hand it off to the discussion to Jody and Jordan. Jordan.
Hi, HKCM. Yo weekses to Jody. How are you?
I'm good. How are you, Jordan? Thanks for having me.
I'm very, very well. I'm so happy that you're able to join us and talk about your experiences. And we want to thank you for your service over the years in government. We want to thank you for your service for many years as our regional chief. And we want to just provide the opportunity for you to help us move this conversation forward. But we wanted to kind of take the time to let you share your experiences that you've laid out in your book. It's quite fascinating reading, I think, to see the other side of the veil and places that we're not necessarily aware of, and the interesting dynamic that you know, as an Indigenous woman, as a leader for many years, reflect on the way we collaborate in our Kwelmach ways and the way we talk. And so I was quite fascinated reading your book, and I just wanted to provide the opportunity to have you share with us your perspectives on what that was like. So we're just, I'm not, as you can tell, I'm not the normal interviewer, so this is a freewheeling open conversation for us today. So tell us.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you again, Jordan, for asking me to come on and to engage in a bit of discussion with you. And I, first of all, do want to acknowledge the territory that I'm on. I am in Ottawa right now on Algonquin territory. I can see Parliament Hill from my window. Thanks to Michelle and to Hugh for their opening words, and to you for our ongoing discussion over many, many years, which has stemmed or rooted from our belief, our shared belief in the importance of First Nations governance and rebuilding governance in our communities. So thanks for having me. And it was through, of course, my being regional chief and being regional chief for almost 6 years and understanding the realities in all of our communities in terms of the lack of proper recognition of our rights as Indigenous peoples and the proper place in terms of intergovernmental relationships with other governments that led me to decide to put my hat in the ring and run to be a member of Parliament in Vancouver. And I'm very honored to have been the member of Parliament and also to have been the Minister of Justice and AG for the years that I was. And Indian in the Cabinet, the book, speaks about those experiences, and it speaks about my experiences as an Indigenous leader, as the regional chief, and the common threads, but also the differences in terms of how governments function, the good, the bad, and the ugly, so to speak. And I will say, and I won't go on for too long because I know our time is short, but there is a very real difference between how we operate as Indigenous peoples in our communities, how we come together and engage, which I believe is to get towards and continue to move towards the ultimate goal of improving the quality of life for our people and being able to govern ourselves and inject our own traditions, laws, and patterns of behavior that have enabled us to survive for so long. Being in the federal government, as I was for many years, it's quite different and has a different way of operating. And I think, it's important for all of us to share our experiences. And that's what I sought to do in writing the book that I did. But I think there's a lot of lessons that can be learned in terms of how not just the federal government, but provincial governments operate, how they make decisions, which aren't necessarily to improve overall quality of life for individuals, but, a cynic would say to get reelected every 4 years. So we need to understand the differences in order for us as First Nations peoples to be strategic in how we organize ourselves, how we rebuild our institutions of government, and how we collaborate. Most importantly, the message that I heard from Michelle and you and Hugh is the recognition that we will be more successful if we collaborate, recognize our interdependency, and bring forward, if it's in terms of fisheries, bring forward a management plan for the entire coast and all of its tributaries, and look towards rebuilding our own individual governance institutions within our communities, within our nations, and through that come together in a stronger way. I know that's a lot to speak about, but there's so much that I know that you've been doing, Jordan, and that the Fisheries Council has been doing that has been led by the leaders in our communities. And I just cannot underscore more the importance of collaboration and having a broad common approach to the fisheries, of which we know they don't stay in one place.
It's amazing that you're speaking to things that just totally resonate with our business plan and our business model, and in your role in terms of like bridge building between the two paradigms between our Indigenous world and our aspirations for expanded self-government. In terms of moving that conversation, there's 630 nations in Canada, 200 plus in BC. In order to bridge build and collaborate, how do you think, or what would your advice be to our people in our nations, in this case, fisheries, natural resources writ large? How do you think that you would advise us, based on your experience, to collaborate more effectively, to work together, and find a common message? Do you have any advice for us in that, based on your experience?
Well, I do, and I provide my advice with the knowledge of, as you said, being on the inside of the federal government, but also being a proud Indigenous person and a leader in our communities, as everybody that's listening in is as well. The advice I would have, and it kind of goes to how we started this conversation, is the importance of us as First Nations communities, as regions, as a province, and then more broadly as First Nations across the country, working together and understanding the current reality of our governing system. Most of our communities are under the Indian Act, and understanding the nature of how we make decisions and come together as a provincial body, and really knowing that the hard work of rebuilding our nations, the hard work of managing the fishery in an appropriate way, has everything to do with how we make decisions between and among ourselves, how we as individual communities and nations enter into negotiations or agreements with other government, in this case particularly the federal government, how we have protocols and interact between and among ourselves as First Nations. These are all conversations that I know have been ongoing but are so fundamentally important, and I'll tell you why. The hardest work that we have to do, and I mentioned this before, is organizing ourselves as individual communities, as First Nations, and approaching issues as much as we can from a common message or thread when we take that message to other governments, the provincial government or the federal government. And from my experience, and there's a new fisheries minister in Ottawa, we'll see how that unfolds and the commitments that are made. But my experience in federal government, I suspect this is the case in the provincial government and other provinces as well, is that the federal government, and I know this from firsthand experience, can take a bit of a sigh of relief. And I'm not condemning the federal government. I see positive signs of the Department of Fisheries and Oceans and other departments applying the 10 principles, which at its base have the recognition of our rights. And that's an important start. Recognizing the honor of the Crown, recognizing the economic component to rights. So the principles, there are hardworking bureaucrats that are trying to operationalize those principles, and that's really important. And there's some positive agreements. But the federal government can take a sigh of relief or sit back when Indigenous communities, when our nations are divided, when we're not speaking when we can with a common voice. So the real opportunity, and this goes to what Hugh Breaker was talking about in terms of climate change and COP26, particularly when it comes to the environment, particularly when it comes to fisheries, which is a common thread across all of our nations in terms of providing sustenance and our way of life. We need to come together on these to put before other governments our views, our positions, to harness jurisdiction, which as far as I know has not been something that has been substantially settled upon or in any agreements, but to make it a partnership in terms of the recognition of our rights and ensure that we have a plan on the coast around shared decision making. That goes beyond one government providing allocations or enabling our communities to various protection measures, but actually engages us in a government to government relationship around jurisdiction and around presenting a formalized plan that ensures conservation and the management of the fisheries. That's what we want to do. That's the opportunity we have as Indigenous peoples to present to government a plan, a comprehensive plan. And it's pretty hard when Indigenous nations are united in terms of a cause and a mandate around a particular issue for the government to not sit up and pay attention and to work to change their patterns of behavior based on their 10 principles that they've adopted based on rights recognition, based on the honor of the Crown, in acknowledging the self-determination and the self-governance of First Nations in terms of the plan that they're putting forward. That's the huge opportunity. And that's what governments are pleased that hasn't been presented to them in a united way. And I don't want to disrespect anybody, but I know that federal bureaucrats and ministers particularly feel a sigh of relief when First Nations are divided.
Excellent points. I think I want to go off the scripted questions a little bit and jump a little bit ahead, because I think you touched on something that I wanted to ask in my third question to you, which was reflecting back in time. A time you're familiar with was the All Chiefs Task Force report in 2010, and it was kind of effectively looking at the councils that were struck and saying, how are we performing? How are we doing? And the task force, indicated that, well, we're not doing as good as we could be because we continue to speak in a fragmented voice. Somebody wants to talk about policy, somebody wants to talk about rights, somebody wants to talk about salmon, somebody wants to talk about habitat, and so we're pulling in different directions. I was talking to my staff earlier and really talking about the obligation of the Crown is to consult where there's the potential to infringe. And the rights need to be kind of like acknowledged in that conversation. And we have the government coming to the table at both the federal and provincial scale under UNDRIP, reconciliation, the 10 principles that you helped to move forward. The question that I have is really, do you think that, I mean, we've structured our processes over the last decade. Do you think we're structured the right way? Is there a more effective way that we can unify our voice so that those Crown public servants don't breathe that sigh of relief, that they go, wow, these guys really have a strong voice and they're united around this issue or that issue? Maybe the biggest priority is capitalizing on UNDRIP and DRIPA and reconciliation. But do you think we're structured the right way currently? Is there something that you would see based on your experience? Is there more effective ways to do it? I don't know whether you've, I'm watching the Slido questions. People are talking about New Zealand and things like that. What do you think? Do we need to be doing something different?
Well, I mean, I'd love to know what the New Zealand question was, but I mean, New Zealand has given rights to water, for example, in the natural world. But in terms of the structure, in terms of the councils, fisheries council and other natural resource councils or First Nations councils generally, there's been a lot of work that has done, good work, and BC is continuing to lead the charge in terms of innovative approaches to engage with other governments, to consultation and accommodation. I will say, however, and this has been my passion and so many others before me and yours and my conversations, Jordan, since I was the regional chief, when we had a platform whose basis was around nation rebuilding, around governance. And I know that there are some self-governing First Nations in British Columbia, but the foundation of proper decision-making moving forward, as I think we all know, is centered around the need for our communities to focus on their internal governing structures, to rebuild their core institutions of government, to enable them to move beyond the Indian Act and to think beyond, which I know we do, and we think beyond our reserves to our ancestral lands and waters. And we certainly have rights and title beyond our reserves, where we need to be self-determining and self-governing. So I would encourage, and to a great degree, all communities are involved in governing governance projects and rebuilding. DRIPA and UNDRIP give our communities a prime opportunity to continue that governance work of rebuilding and being self-determining over our traditional territories. And in doing so, we need to partner, we need to collaborate, we need to have protocols between and among ourselves, which will, and this is nothing against the decision-making bodies that the Fisheries Council has right now, but imagine a place where we have reconstituted Indigenous nations in British Columbia that are coming together to manage one of our most, if not our most important resource, that being our fisheries. But we have reconstituted governance with their own constitutions, their own decision-making processes, their own governing structures that they've determined for themselves by their citizens, coming together and putting forward co-management arrangement suggestions to other governments, and then having that intergovernmental relationship thrive even further. So we need to, as communities, move beyond the Indian Act to take Article 3 in the Declaration, which speaks to self-determination, and enable it to be alive and well in our communities, to translate those minimum standards into practical and meaningful benefits on the ground in our communities. That's the hard work that we have to do. That will form the foundation of regional, provincial, and national structures that are fueled by reconstituted Indigenous governments.
Amazing. That's totally the theme that I wanted you to speak to. It's totally resonating with me. You know that for many years I've been on council at Musqueam, and we are in that self-governing negotiations. One of the things from the Fisheries Council perspective that we always want to message, just for everybody that's watching today, is that we're not a rights holder at the Fisheries Council, And the rights-based conversation is a bilateral conversation between the Crown and those rights holders. Having said that, though, there are overarching issues that may affect nations, whether it's marine shipping and or oceans protection, that may go beyond an individual nation. And so the concept of how they reconstitute their governing structures, and then how we in turn build something that works collaboratively on the big picture things. Do you have any advice for us on that? I mean, like recognizing that rights-based is a bilateral conversation, but there may be things, whether it's legislation or national policies, those things that we need to work on together. Do you have any, from your perspective of working with the bureaucracy, is there ways that you can help to just give us a comment on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I agree. I mean, individual rights are held by the nation, and engaging with other governments is a process of direct engagement. But I will say, exercising rights have an impact on our neighbors, on other Indigenous communities, particularly where it's around resources like fish. So we need to continue to collaborate in that way. And how do we do that? Well, I mean, I speak a lot about this in the book, and how it is that I am so honored to be and proud to be Indigenous, and recognize that we have different ways of being and engagement between and amongst ourselves. Something that is lacking in the federal government or the provincial government. And it is the necessity to recognize our interconnected nature. And as I was taught from a very young age, and I know you as well, Jordan, from Musqueam and everybody else listening, is to function as best we can in changing around consensus-based decision-making, changing our patterns of behavior that have been imposed on us by other governments through the Indian Act, what have you, but going back to working, and it's hard and it takes a lot more time, but getting in a room and having these discussions. And while we may not always agree as Indigenous peoples, coming together in that room about a particular approach to an issue, that we stay there and we come up those issues or approaches, whether it's legislation, policy, or otherwise, that impact beyond our community or beyond our own nation. The importance of actually coming to, if we can, consensus around an approach to a particular issue, that is powerful, of course, for all of us as Indigenous peoples, but it's powerful in terms of presenting to other governments. So I would encourage us to continue along our ways of being in terms of building consensus-based decision-making as we look to various shared decision-making models, cooperative management, and the exercise of our rights across all of our ancestral lands, which impact each and every one of us.
Thank you so much. I'm getting prompted now because I have to share you with some of the questions from the people out in the virtual world. I want to say HKSM to you, and I know you're back looking at, you're taking care of your place back in Ottawa. So I want to wish you safe travels, and I'll turn it over to Michelle because I think she's going to go to some live questions. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Jordan. I'll see you when I get back home.
All right.
Thank you, Jody. We'll now open the floor to questions. Please use the Slido box to enter your questions. And thankfully, we have a few questions that have already been posed, Jody. And again, it looks really sunny where you are, and I'm a little bit jealous.
It's getting dark here, Michelle. I'm in Ottawa, but it is like the sunset. So, yeah.
Okay, well, it's, dark and gray here. So what do you see as the best way to unite Indigenous nations to impact the legislative reform needed to change laws to better involve us in a proper decision-making?
Well, and it's a really important question. And I think fundamentally, we as Indigenous peoples have to continue to approach the development of legislation, of policies based on an understanding and solid in the view that we have rights, that we have inherent rights that cannot be taken away from us, and to work and to continue to press, whether it be the federal government or the provincial government, but in this case particularly the federal government, to develop a comprehensive rights recognition framework that actually operationalizes by way of legislation the 10 principles that the federal government has put out, what the Prime Minister promised in terms of legislating rights recognition and enabling our nations to be self-determining, move beyond the Indian Act when they're ready, willing, and able. There's an extraordinary amount of work that First Nations have put forward, and we need to collectively continue to press the federal government and other governments to ensure that we don't have to continue to negotiate in interminable negotiations or go to court to prove that our rights exist. The government needs to move away from denying our rights to the proper recognition of our rights. And in so doing, through legislation and policy, enable a proper relationship that is not one where one party, in this case the federal government, has dominion over us, because we as Indigenous peoples have inherent rights, we have title and rights, and they need to be recognized, and we collectively need to operationalize them.
Thanks, Jody. That's extremely insightful. I know we have a question from Ken that's not necessarily directed at fish, and I'm reminded of the recent referendum we had on proportional representation in British Columbia a few years ago. And I think this actually speaks to that in a way, because I remember the outcome of what First Nations had to say. But in New Zealand, the Maori have guaranteed seats in Parliament. Do you think we could use UNDRIP to force government to do the same for First Nations?
Well, I mean, hey, Ken, I wish I could see people, but I can see your question. I mean, I think it's an important question to have conversations around, and I would encourage our people to continue, and I know, Michelle, you did, and other Indigenous peoples to put their name forward to run in the federal government, the provincial government. I think that, first of all, UNDRIP presents a human rights framework that is important and now is legislated both in Canada and in British Columbia. I think the more Indigenous voices in Parliament, the better. Having different worldviews that focus on collaboration, sustainability, Mother Earth is incredibly important. And it's not necessarily embraced in Parliament right now. I would say let's think about let's have a debate and discussion around having a minimum number of seats in Parliament. Yeah, it would be great. I'm not sure if UNDRIP enables that necessarily. And I love Ken, but I feel and believe fundamentally rebuilding our institutions of government, while at the same time having so many of our people running in the federal election, provincial elections is important, but rebuilding our governments and our institutions and determining how we're going to govern ourselves is just as important. Actually, I think it's more important. So we can take examples from around the world, including the Maori who have those seats. I think it would be wonderful to do that. It's through political will and lobbying and pressure on parliamentarians that might come to pass. But how we operationalize UNDRIP on the ground in our communities and rebuild is the greatest opportunity we have to change the face of governance in Canada. And I think that I know this from experience. And I went to Ottawa wanting to create the space, or trying to assist creating the space for our nations to rebuild within a stronger Canada. And I realized that Parliament and other governments have a lot to learn, or that they can learn from our traditional ways, our laws and ways of being that have survived for millennia. I don't know if that really answers your question, Ken, but I think we can do a whole bunch of things on a lot of different fronts.
Thanks, Jody. That was incredible. It's a tough question to answer, and I agree. We've got to spend some time looking at our own governance structures. I've got a question from Maxine. We're in a time of reconciliation. What are other nations doing around reconciliation and nation building?
Oh my God, it's such a great question. And I mean, that would take us like 2 days, 3 days to talk about how many, all the different initiatives that are underway. Maybe I'll answer it by saying this. There's a lot of success in our communities in British Columbia, certainly, but across the country in terms of communities that have sectoral governance initiatives, communities that are entirely self-governing, communities that have entered into other arrangements with other governments. These are all examples that we need to learn from. And maybe this is a bit of it's not a shameless plug, but it's a plug for the work that people and communities and leaders have done in British Columbia that when I was regional chief, and I've had conversations with regional chief TG about this, is actually the governance toolkit that we collectively put together that told the story of the success stories that nation building activities that our communities have been in. I'm in the process and working with others in terms of updating that and being able to tell the story of reconciliation that's happening in other communities. That may be by way of exercising rights over the land base, rebuilding core institutions of government, other agreements, and managing the reality of the colonial legacy and healing residential schools and ensuring that we have the proper say when it comes to how we move beyond and work with other governments in terms of residential schools and the revelations for other Canadians about the mass graves that we always knew were there. So we need to tell the story more. We need media to tell the story more, and we need to continue to come together as Indigenous peoples, and whether that's through working on an updated governance toolkit together and sharing our experiences beyond between and among ourselves and beyond British Columbia, I think is incredibly important. But there's Maxine, there's huge success stories out there, and we need to build on those.
Thanks, Jody. So we have about 30 seconds left. I'm going to give them to you to say some closing remarks.
Well, thank you. And this is very efficient and very sophisticated. So the Fisheries Council, you guys are pretty awesome. And I mean, all joking aside, and that wasn't a joke, but I really appreciate the opportunity to be with you for, a half an hour today. And I want to say to all the people online that I can't see, all the leaders that continue to do the hard work on the ground in your communities, how important it is. The major thing that I learned in terms of going to Ottawa, being in the cabinet, being a member of parliament, when it comes to Indigenous peoples, is the more that we can come together, the more that we can speak with a common message and demands and are rooted in our communities and our governing structures, the stronger we will be as Indigenous peoples, the more other governments will listen to us. And thankfully, with Canadians seemingly coming more and more on our side as allies and advocating for the proper recognition of our rights, the better the country will be. So I'm going to continue to work hard around governance, work hard in terms of advocating for our rights and our issues. And I hope that I can come back and continue to do some work and chat with Jordan and the Fisheries Council and all of you. So Galak Hasla, thank you. And I can't wait to get back to the West Coast.
Thank you, Jody. Thank you, everyone, for your participation. I want to thank you again, Jody, for reminding us how important it is for us to work together. We are stronger when we work together. And I want to thank you for being a champion of helping us to understand the limitations of what Ottawa can and cannot do for us. They have been invaluable as we as leaders in BC are trying to advocate our right place at the table for our Indigenous people. So with that, we're going to go to a short break for about a minute. I want to thank everybody. Get up, have a stretch, get a coffee, and we'll see you in 1 minute. And we're back with our next segment featuring collaborative government initiatives and updates while First Nations in BC play a key role in accessing and managing inherent governance processes of aquatic resources. It is, of course, important to understand the involvement at all levels of government on key decisions and their respective plans and priorities. The Regional Director General of the Pacific Region, Reid, will now give you a high-level overview of DFO plans, priorities, and related program activities in the Pacific Region. Welcome, Rebecca.
Thanks very much, Michelle. Nice to see you, and hi, everybody. Appreciate the opportunity to speak today. It's great to be back. So as Michelle said, I'm Rebecca Reid. I'm the Regional Director General for DFO Pacific Region. I would like to acknowledge that I have the privilege of joining you today on the territories of the Squamish, the Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam Nations. I'd also like to recognize our valued partner, the First Nations Fishery Council, for the significant effort that they have put into organizing this virtual assembly, and on behalf of DFO, to express our appreciation for the invitation to this event. So I actually have a slide presentation this year, which is nice. And what I thought I would do is spend some time talking about some of the key developments and priorities for this region. So the first piece on the next slide, please, is that as has already been stated, we have a new minister. New federal cabinet was sworn in on October 26th, and we're very pleased to welcome the Honourable Joyce Murray as Minister of Fisheries, Oceans, and the Canadian Coast Guard. Having a minister from BC means that we can get to the essence of issues very quickly, and briefings are well underway. There's a lot of talk before Parliament resumes, which we think will be on November 22nd. So just a word on COVID. I certainly don't need to tell you, any of you, that 2021 has been a very challenging year. COVID-19 continues to have a significant impact on communities across BC, and particularly those in the north. We continue to exercise flexibility wherever possible in order to be responsive to changing needs and circumstances. We're also implementing the Government of Canada's mandatory vaccination policy for the core public administration, as well as ensuring that fishing activities are conducted in a manner that adheres to public health advice and guidelines and protects coastal communities. As you know, the rules continue to be adjusted as the situation changes, and we will continue to implement the necessary procedures to ensure staff, our partners, and clients are kept safe. Certainly climate change is up close and personal these days. Yesterday I looked out my window at the incredible storm that had whipped up, only later to realize that I actually was on the outer edge of a tornado, the third one in recorded history in this region. This week, the third weather bomb is being predicted to land here, and of course, who will ever forget last summer's heat dome? The devastating forest fires, the loss of communities, the impact to all of our lives. We will continue to witness and live the changes brought about by climate change to our ocean ecosystems. In DFO, our ocean scientists continue to undertake research and monitoring to better understand the impacts of climate change while for our oceans, and seek ways to address the challenges of climate adaptation while finding mitigation opportunities. In addition, the economic landscape related to fisheries continues to evolve, and we must find ways to adapt to the changes and support coastal and Indigenous communities that depend on healthy fishing industry. In the next slide, about reconciliation, as I reflect on this year, I'm mindful of the wounds that resurfaced in the face of revelations regarding unmarked burials at former residential school site at the Sikmega, sorry, I totally messed that up, and at other sites across the country. For me, the living reality of the harms that have been done underscores the importance of government's commitment to reconciliation. Along with our federal counterparts, Fisheries and Oceans Canada shares responsibility for contributing to new relationships based on respect and recognition of rights. Building off DFO's National Reconciliation Strategy, all of the programs in Pacific Region have developed specific commitments in order to advance reconciliation and new relationships. This is central to our work as we support implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Since last year's assembly, DFO has continued to work to advance treaty and reconciliation agreements at 30 tables. We're very pleased to conclude a number of important agreements this year, including the Coastal First Nation Fisheries Resource Reconciliation Agreement, the Haida Changing Tide Framework Agreement, and the Tsleil-Waututh Nation Burrard Inlet Environmental Science and Stewardship Agreement. We also recognize that food security is critical for Indigenous communities, particularly in the COVID-19 pandemic. We have been working with several communities to address impacts during this pandemic and to address urgent food security needs from other major events such as wildfires. Despite this progress, we know that much more work lies ahead, and we're committed to continuing work with your communities and organizations on the path to reconciliation. So the next slide talks about a couple of important initiatives. Pacific Salmon Strategy Initiative. So I'm sure many of you know earlier this year, the Government of Canada announced $647 million over 5 years for the Pacific Salmon Strategy Initiative, which is the largest ever government investment in efforts to save Pacific salmon. We've all seen the state of our salmon populations and understand that climate change, habitat loss, and fishing pressures are negatively impacting Pacific salmon at every stage of their life cycle. The PSSI, as we call it, will guide a long-term response to stabilize and protect Pacific salmon for ecosystems, people, and communities that depend on their sustainability. It is early days for this program, but one thing's for certain, we can't and shouldn't do this alone, which is why collaborative action is key to this initiative. We anticipate beginning further engagements on early implementation on this important initiative later this fall. And I'm very pleased that my colleagues, Wes Shoemaker and Sarah Murdoch, will be joining you tomorrow to talk about this in a lot more detail. As part of the Pacific Salmon Strategy Initiative budget announcement, the federal government committed to double the BC Restoration and Innovation Fund, we call it BC SRIF, with an additional $100 million. And BC has also promised to double their contribution. This is great news for fish and communities, as it will allow us to extend the program and advance projects. Since the program began in 2019, there's been about $125 million invested to support more than 90 projects. These projects are a diverse range of activities, and of them, nearly 64% are either Indigenous-led or involve partnerships with Indigenous communities and organizations. I would like to talk about the Big Bar landslide for a moment as well and acknowledge the ongoing large-scale collaborative efforts to address the Big Bar landslide and support migrating salmon. As of last month, more than 1.9 million salmon have migrated past the slide site using the nature-like fishway that is presently in place. We hope this significant milestone, in addition to the release of 100,000 Chinook and 112,000 early Stewart fry, sockeye fry earlier this year, will support the rebuilding of those salmon populations which continue to be impacted by the slide. Enhancement operations conducted in partnership with First Nations are critical to the Big Bar landslide response and conservation efforts. Under the Salmon Enhancement Program, DFO licensed 2 new community involvement projects this year, which include partnerships with the Takla and Nakazali First Nation in support of the Big Bar landslides response. With the support and input of First Nation partners, third-party consultants, and the province of BC, we are also in the process of developing and analyzing options for a long-term solution to address the complex challenge of safely restoring natural fish passage at Big Bar. And working with our partners, we continue to coordinate enhancement, monitoring, and fish transport programs for the 2022 salmon migration season. Just a quick word on I think actually I'm a slide behind now. Okay, would you mind advancing the slide just one, please? Thank you. Yeah, just one back. I just forgot to advance it before. Just a quick word on the Fisheries Act implementation. As you're aware, the Fisheries Act was changed in 2019 after many years of hard work and extensive engagement with many organizations, including the FNFC. In order to implement the changes, DFO is working with First Nations to facilitate their feedback on the first wave of engagement topics related to the protection of fish and fish habitat. This is a nationally driven initiative. However, in an effort to provide opportunities for Pacific region groups to be meaningfully engaged, we'll continue to supplement national engagement activities and remain your primary point of contact. Okay, so now to the next slide on southern resident killer whales. In 2021, we continued to implement protections for SRKW, including measures to support increased Chinook salmon availability and minimize physical and acoustic disturbance. The measures were developed following discussions with Indigenous groups, technical experts, and the Indigenous and multi-stakeholder advisory group and technical working groups, as well as Indigenous and stakeholder consultations. We are currently engaging with First Nations through the multi-nation Tier 1 and 2 process, Indigenous and multi-stakeholder advisory group, technical working groups, and bilaterally to inform the development of the 2022 management measures. With regards to aquaculture, DFO is committed to improving the management and sustainability of this industry while strengthening partnerships with First Nations. Just a reminder that the Government of Canada committed to work with the province of British Columbia and Indigenous communities to create a responsible plan to transition from open net pen salmon farming in coastal British Columbia by 2025. There's a strategic oversight committee and a technical working group consisting of representatives from the First Nations Fishery Council and the province of BC have been formed to advise on development of this plan. In addition, DFO will work with First Nations and stakeholders to pilot area-based management approaches to planning, management, and monitoring of aquaculture activities within the next 2 years, leading the way to developing aquaculture practices that are economically, environmentally, and socially sustainable and acknowledge unique area values. DFO continues to work closely with First Nations Fisheries Council, Aquaculture Coordinating Committee, and I appreciate the ongoing work and collaboration. Well, slide 7 is about marine planning initiatives. On the oceans front, DFO is working hard to help deliver on the Government of Canada's commitment to conserve 25% of Canada's marine and coastal areas by 2025 and working towards 30% by 2030. With respect to the Northern Shelf bioregion, we are engaging with 18 First Nations as well as the province of BC in a collaborative planning process to develop an action plan for a marine protected area network along the north and central coast. We're also reaching out to other First Nations that are not yet part of this process to understand their priorities and share opportunities for participation. Regarding the southern BC marine spatial planning process, we are in the early stages of gathering information and building on a foundation to inform future planning phases. Just a word on the Blue Economy strategy. So as Canada charts its economic recovery from COVID-19, we anticipate the Blue Economy strategy will form a key part of the government's agenda. To inform the strategy, the federal government engaged with provinces and territories, First Nations industry, and other stakeholders and the public. We expect there will be further opportunities to engage with First Nations to inform the development and implementation of this important initiative in the coming months. So stay tuned on that one. And so just slide 8, just a look forward. I guess there's one more slide after this. I just want to thank you again most sincerely for the invitation to participate in today's annual General Assembly and for your ongoing efforts. I'm definitely looking forward to hearing ideas for innovative ways of working together. Thank each and every one of you for taking part in this process of respect, partnership, and cooperation. Central to all aspects of what we do at DFO is the work we undertake with First Nations communities and organizations like the First Nations Fisheries Council. I'm proud of our work together on many initiatives, and I look forward to strengthening these important partnerships. We are committed to working with Indigenous people, the government of the BC government, and all stakeholders to ensure the principles of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People are upheld in our work. As we move forward in delivering on this mandate and advancing reconciliation, I'm thankful for the Indigenous leaders, community members, technical staff, and resource managers from across the province that are here this week to advance ideas and work together to identify important issues. And finally, because no presentation is complete without an organizational update, just wanted to move to slide 9, and just to highlight that this last year has brought a number of changes to the region's executive team, and so I thought I would just inform you and give you a list of them, some of which I'm sure you're already aware of through your work with us. Of note, though, I highlight a couple. Andy Thompson, who has taken on the role of Regional Director of Science after a very long time as Regional Director of Fisheries Management. Neil Davis, who has agreed to take on the Regional Director of Fisheries Management, and Tracy Sangaith is as the Regional Director of the Ecosystems Management Branch. I'm also very, very pleased to note that the Pacific Salmon Strategy Initiative is being led by Wes Shoemaker as executive head for that transformation, with Sarah Murdoch taking on the role of Senior Director. So just thank you once again for inviting me to speak with you today. I appreciate your patience as I dropped my computer off my desk. And if we still have time for questions, I'm happy to answer them now. Thank you.
So audience members, we're now ready to take your questions. Please enter them through the Slido box. And I see I've got a few questions here already, and I'm going to jump to Maxine's. Thank you, Rebecca, for mentioning reconciliation. How can we partner and collaborate in stock and nation rebuilding?
Thanks very much, Maxine, for the question. I mean, I think it is a fundamental question about the ways that we can engage. I think that the reconciliation agenda as delivered or as supported by DFO has been a significant priority for us. And so, I mean, it's a complex answer, but it starts with our Department of Justice leading an implementation of the Act respecting the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And it goes from there to a review of the laws and policies and guidelines that go all the way down to individuals within the organization. It speaks about sort of the change in culture we need to have as a department, and the ways in which we work with Indigenous people going forward that sort of speaks to some of the issues that Jody Wilson-Raybould talked about the coordination, the collaboration, and the sort of the mutual understanding of each other. So there's definitely, I think, a lot of work, but we've also made, I think, some significant progress, and we have some great examples of where it's been working well.
Thanks, Rebecca. We have a question here, and I do know some of the work has been going on with respect to the Fraser Salmon Collaborative Management Agreement. So the question is, how will DFO be held accountable to successfully implement their commitment to the struggling Fraser Salmon Collaborative Management Agreement with the mandated Fraser Basin's First Nations leaders responsible to the 76 participating First Nations communities?
So thanks for that. I mean, I think the Fraser Salmon Management Council, when it was signed a couple of years ago, was I think a culmination of an intense amount of work over a very significant time period, and it was something that DFO that I personally was extremely happy about, and it really reflect sort of the amount of effort it would take to bring that many nations together, working for a common cause. So we each have a role at the table. We need to work together, and we need to find ways to do that. And so I think it is a matter of taking the time, working through the issues, as you say, being accountable or transparent with each other, and being clear about sort of what works and what doesn't, how we can make decisions together, and where issues arise that we talk them through. So, I mean, I would be the first to say we've got a lot of work to do, but I think that the organization and the agreement is something it's worth keeping, and we need to work together to make it a success.
Right, thanks. I have a few more questions, and I know we have short a time right now. But in terms of the PSSI, how much of the 647 million is allocated to license retirement? Are there specific fleet reduction goals anticipated by the FOC?
So what I would suggest on that is, because Sarah and Wes are going to be presenting tomorrow, that if you don't mind just holding those questions to tomorrow, you'll get a lot more detail. I can kind of spin it off the top of my head, but I think
I can wait till tomorrow.
Presentation. Yeah. Okay.
Awesome. Okay. Last question. We got 20 seconds. How do you like working with the working relationship with First Nations Fisheries Council?
So I highly value the FNFC, the leadership, and all the people who work there. I just want to express my extreme gratitude and appreciation for the collaboration over the years and the continued innovation as we move forward together. So thank you.
Thank you. Those are all the questions the speaker can answer today. Some questions may be answered later in writing and also in another panel. Now we'd like to hear from you in some key areas. What areas are important to your nation or organization when we are considering the future of DFO activities? Updating policies and programs, science programs and research, fisheries, rebuilding fish and fish habitat protection. So please go ahead and use Slido to select your answer, and we'll be back to you in a little bit. Good. Thank you, everyone, for participating in the poll. It is clear by the outcome of this poll that fisheries rebuilding and fish habitat protection are the number one area of concern to our people, as mentioned by Jody as well, and Jordan earlier, and Hugh. So this will help shape the work going forward for the First Nations Fisheries Council. So we thank you again for participating. We'll now proceed with the Province of BC's update. The First Nations Fisheries Council and the provincial government have been working to implement the 2019 MOU, which creates an opportunity for multiple ministries to come to a common table and collaborate and coordinate plans and programs to achieve better outcomes for fish, water, habitat, and aquatic marine ecosystems. We welcome ADM, James Mack, Environmental Sustainability Division, Ministry of Environment and Climate Change Strategy. He will provide an update on behalf of the province. James, the floor is all yours.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for letting me join in. My name is James Mack. I'm the Assistant Deputy Minister at the Ministry of Environment here in BC, and I'm dialing in from Victoria, so the territory of the Kwanghan-speaking peoples. I just wanted to present today a bit of an update on some key files for the province and the work we're doing with the First Nations Fisheries Council. So if I can get right into it, maybe we can put the PowerPoint up. Yeah, and just move to the second slide here. So I think this is text that everyone's seen before. This is our provincial mandates around reconciliation. I guess the main point I just wanted to flag here is that for all of us working in the province, every single ministry has the same commitment to really be focused on creating those opportunities for Indigenous peoples and working towards lasting reconciliation. So as we advance every priority file within government, one of the things that Cabinet is expecting of all of us is to really look in and see how we're working with First Nations, and to make sure we're doing this in a way where we are fully engaged and in many cases co-developing our policy work with First Nations. Part of that is for policies and laws. It's about the Declaration Act. Part of it is with a corporate exercise now to develop an action plan under the Declaration Act. And one of the things that we have talked about through that action plan was these commitments around watersheds, salmon, and coastal marine strategies. And the last point I'll make on this slide is what we'd heard doing an engagement work on that draft action plan with nations across BC was the priority in particular around water had emerged as one of the top priorities flagged by First Nations of where we really need to lean in and work in a different way and to really prioritize those resources. So that direction was part of how we talked to Cabinet. It was part of how Cabinet has set the direction for how they want us to proceed. And I'll, in this update, flag for you a little bit about where those component files are at and how we want to work with First Nations Fisheries Councils and others in the development of those pieces. Can we go to the next slide, please? So here we have, as a province, a memorandum of understanding with the First Nations Fisheries Council. And what's interesting here is that it does bring in several ministries, our Ministry for Indigenous Relations, my ministry, the Ministry of Environment, the Ministry for Agriculture and Fisheries and Food, as well as FNFC, Ministry of Forestry, Land, and Natural Resource Operations. We've had that MOU for some time. Environment, our intent is to sign on to that MOU formally. We've been working informally with that exercise to date. The MOU is probably not that interesting. It's the work that we do that actually becomes of interest. And what we have now is a joint steering committee with myself and my colleagues around the province, with Jordan Point and his team, to try to set out those priorities and how we'll work. And then from there, it flows down into the technical capacity on both sides of how we can work together. So the FNFC is great for us because it can provide that real technical advice from First Nations on how to approach these issues, but it also helps us think through some of the more, I'll call it the strategic process advice of how we can advance this. So on the action plan, we've worked with them. Now that we're starting on developing these new policies, we've been able to see from FNFC where we're at on that. Likewise, FNFC has come to us with its own policy work that it's done with First Nations around where it would like to see some of these things go. And importantly, we're really looking to FNFC to help us build an engagement process that really is collaborative and works with existing mechanisms where we've got them, and then creates new ones where we need them. So next slide. So here, what we're showing is the three key strategies that really frame our work: salmon, coastal marine, watershed security strategy. One message we've heard loud and clear from the broad engagement on the action plan, as well as the work with FNFC. Can we go back to this one here? Thanks, slide 4. One thing that we've been asked to do is to please not come out and do a process for every single strategy, that where the strategies work together, to try to find a single way to make that work. What you see with these is we have looked at this from a pure policy lens, and there are areas that overlap in all these. And I think it's an obvious point that watersheds and salmon and our coastal marine environment are going to come together and be a common thing. But there are also elements on each of those strategies that are unique to them. And so we will be doing stuff on a watershed security strategy, for example, it's going to take a look at drinking water issues that are separate from what we might see in a salmon and coastal marine strategy. So the trick here for us in working with you is how do we bring those together where it makes sense, but then acknowledge that it's not all the same thing, that there's going to be some differences. And that's really, this is our initial draft to illustrate that point. This is the kind of information we've talked to the Premier and Ministers about, but it's a starting place for talking with First Nations, and those bullet points will change as we've done work and involve First Nations in their own perspective. Next slide, please. On the watershed security strategy, so one is, this is in my minister's mandate letter. We have gone and talked about some key policy issues that we're looking at as a province in terms of where we would like to see some changes. This is one, as I said earlier, that is a top priority by First Nations through the action plan to really do a co-development process. And so we have gone to Cabinet and gotten a mandate to really lean in and explore how we can do this in a different way with First Nations. And we flagged the First Nations Fisheries Council as a key partner in helping us do that. It looks to us that there are a lot of places where we can talk about watersheds, but we don't yet have a single place to go to talk about water issues with First Nations across BC. And so we are right now, we've gone and talked to Cabinet about how we want to do this and where the provincial approach would be. We have started that work with FNFC in that development. We're talking now about moving to what we have sort of described in early conversations as a water table, but some forum where we can engage with First Nations at a strategic leadership level and really talk about what co-development might look like for a watershed security strategy for BC. I think one thing that's interesting with these commitments is that we have a commitment for a strategy, but we also are committed to a fund. And so I think you'll all have engaged in processes where we're not quite sure whether we'll have financial resources to implement change. We don't have a pot of money yet, but we do have that government commitment to create a fund to do this work. And we know that it's going to tackle a series of issues, which I flagged above. But I think as a general principle, we know the trade-off decisions around watersheds are going to get harder and harder. And so having an ability to engage in local governance models and get those impossible decisions happening closer to the watershed where those trade-offs occur is going to be key. And obviously to have a key role for First Nations in that decision-making process. Next slide. Coastal marine strategy, again, very complementary to watersheds, but tackling a much broader range of issues. We've illustrated some here that are being advanced right away around how we look at ports and species at risk, anchorages. There is a lot of existing tables, in particular the marine area planning partnerships, where we can go and talk about what a coastal strategy could look like. A key part of this is the federal aspect. There are a lot of federal initiatives that will complement this work. So in particular, new commitments around a blue economy. And this strategy will be moving in the same timelines as a watershed strategy so that we can really, the processes that we create and build around the watershed strategy will be used at the coastal marine strategy, and we'll be able to work on them again simultaneously with you. Slide 7. And for the wild salmon strategy, again, some objectives here, but to flag that I think an obvious point for the First Nations Fisheries Council, but salmon is both a coastal issue and an interior issue. The problem is severe and it's urgent. There are some funding commitments now for the province. We will be doubling what's called the BC Salmon Restoration and Innovation Fund. That is a fund done in partnership with DFO. It's also a key priority that's coming to us out of the action plan. And so this one, again, will move in conjunction with watersheds and the coastal marine strategy. And we will be working with FNFC and other processes we developed to do this in a single process. Next slide. So I just wanted to maybe make some observations on how to move forward. So the first one is, I think what we've heard is that these three strategies are clear priorities as First Nations have read through the action plan. They're priorities for us too. So my goal is that you'll see the level of work with the province on these be different than what you've seen before. We are looking, it's early days, but our goal on the watershed security strategy is to co-develop that strategy with First Nations. And I anticipate similar approaches as we get moving on the coastal marine strategy and the salmon strategy. One of the things that I would flag about the work is that it's, to date, working with First Nations Fisheries Council has been a real benefit to us as a province. And we have our own mechanisms internally to work together, but actually having a single partner like the FNFC forces that discipline around the MOU and around the province, trying to figure out how these pieces work together as we come and work with a partner. And it helps us meet our own goals. We also don't want to have three distinct strategies that bump up against each other and conflict. And much like communities and First Nations don't want to go through repetitive processes talking about the same thing. And so, in fact, I would argue that having the mechanisms with FNFC that we do have created that discipline on us to try to make this make sense. As an example of that, the financial agreements that we are striking with the FNFC around this work, we actually have done what might seem like a simple thing, but it's rarely done, but having one financial agreement with FNFC for the province, and then the work across these strategies and across these ministries dovetail into that one agreement. It makes a lot of sense for the FNFC not to have to report against multiple parallel arrangements. But to be honest, it's not something as a province we do that often, and even though it makes a ton of sense. So I was quite excited to hear personally that we were able to get that one done. I will say that we've got our own provincial scope around how these issues are gonna work, but there will be stuff that's important to you and to us that we want to add to the work. And so while we have productive conversations, we'd love to tackle either hot topics, like I've mentioned, interior Fraser steelhead here, which will be added to the salmon strategy, or those priorities that you bring forward as part of this co-development approach that you think should be in there that we haven't seen or haven't thought of. So I think we're advanced enough to give a sense of what's coming and where we want to go, but early enough that there'll be a very key role for FNFC and for other First Nations interests to really develop this work with us. This is my last slide. I'll just mention as a closing comment, although I think I'll likely get questions on this. We have to date already been working with the Government of Canada around their priorities in these spaces. I mentioned some earlier around salmon as well as the blue economy. There's also federal interest in a Canada Water Agency, a new Canada Water Agency with various new investments in water coming through that, as well as a lot of federal interest in the Pacific Coast and how to increase investment and performance in that area. So we have opened those conversations, but again, I think they're often hard to do in an integrated way. And I think with FNFC having its relationship with DFO, it's a key reason why we're partnering with you is to get to that G to G to G process and to be able to really integrate across multiple interests towards common goals. That's it for my overview. I see I've got a few minutes on the clock, but I was hoping to open it up for questions.
Thank you, James. We're now opening the floor to questions. Please go through your Slido box to enter any questions you might have for James. However, James, we do already have a couple questions in the Slido. And with the adoption of the declaration, I can't actually read the entire question, so if you give me 1 second to see it. There we go. With the adoption of the Declaration Act and the development of the draft action plan, what steps does BC plan to take to ensure the co-development, co-design, and co-delivery of policies, legislation, and programs with First Nations?
Yeah. Well, I think the first step, both for the province and also what I've heard from First Nations, is like capacity is a real thing. So we can't do everything on day one. What I have seen the action plan as really a unique in my career is it actually has given us a corporate conversation with First Nations around the priorities for reconciliation, and water and salmon and coastal strategies have emerged as priorities amongst priorities. So the first thing to answer that question is we've heard from First Nations that if we're to start anywhere, those are the ones that we should focus on. And so we've reflected that in our cabinet mandate. I can speak most to the watershed strategy, although I'm on the other two as well. But our goal there is co-development with First Nations. So that's not a provincial strategy that you're consulted on or a draft strategy that you have input into. It's actually a process to really work in a collaborative way to co-develop a strategy that meets both their interests. The second one is the mechanisms. We don't have an existing mechanism to do this on watersheds. So we've really worked with the First Nations Fisheries Council. The FNFC did a really impressive document for us in the early days around what legislative reforms and policy ideas might look like that were of interest. And so we've been working from there. But again, we're really looking to that technical and process advice from the FNFC. It's a great way for us to make sure we're working in the right way, and it's a way for us to get out there. It will be in addition to our treaty obligations, of course, but I think a creation of this new leadership table on water will be a key step to get that strategic input at a leadership level for what we want to do.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So this is from Maxine. I feel that building relations between nations in the province in the area of stewarding the natural resources, instead of how the government is creating opportunities for First Nations. What's your thoughts on partnering and collaboration?
Right. I hope I'm getting the gist of the question here. I think, so my thoughts on partnering and collaboration. Well, I'll come back to the watershed issue. We have in British Columbia a real problem on our hands with water. And it's part of it is industrial development, part of it's population growth, and part of it's climate change. So we're just going to be facing harder and harder decisions around use of water in our watersheds. And so one of the principles that we're advancing there, part of that is the principle of self-determination for First Nations, which is one of our 10 principles that we've accepted as a government. So we know there's got to be a role for First Nations decision making in how we make decisions on water. And so we need to figure out what that is. But at a higher level principle, when you're dealing with impossible trade-off decisions, the credibility of those decisions is best when you're dealing with them as close as you can to where the impacts are felt. And so there will always be a role for the province to make strong provincial level decisions on water. But how do we elevate and get those decisions that really meet the test with First Nations and other groups that are in those watersheds to try to make those more engaged and better decisions, but importantly, credible when we start dealing with the tough trade-offs in water issues. And we're going to see the same thing on salmons and other issues in our coastal community. So we are looking at part of this as, policy and program problems, but I think fundamental on these are questions of governance, which are going to be hard to figure out, but I think absolutely key to meeting what you're talking about in your questions there.
How will the province work with First Nations and the federal government to build tripartite structures and processes to advance coordinated cross-jurisdictional governance and policy development?
Yeah, good question. And if you have the answer, please follow up with me. I think it's hard. So first off, it's hard enough to get the province working as a single entity and then to work with Canada. It is a challenge. We spend a lot of effort, and we got to apply that effort now working with First Nations. I do have some hope on this, though, because I have seen firsthand with the First Nations Fisheries Council that forcing us to work with one entity, even just tackling those issues we work with FNFC on, it creates that discipline backwards to make us, first off, work consistently as a provincial family, but then also with DFO, who has similar relationships. So I do see these as models, and I see the creation of this watershed table as it's going to fill a gap for us to start actually tackling those issues that you're seeing. But I do, I need to be cautious because they're tough issues, but I do see a greater governance role as, typically we do policies and programs, but we're going to have some real governance questions to face here. In some cases, we've made some progress already. I think in particular, the coastal marine strategy, there's some very strong processes and capacity established with First Nations now that we can build on. And I think we'll need to go from there and do more.
Awesome. Okay, so Don's got a question. It is our hope, wishes, and prayers for Premier John Horgan to have a speedy full recovery. However, can marine area planning include watersheds that feed into those coastal areas, particularly South Coast?
Yeah. Well, one is I think that's up for discussion. So on the coastal marine strategy, it's not just the coastline. It will include the areas that I'll say feed into the coastline. So it's likely, and we'll just have to see how First Nations and the other entities we want to work with, what type of feedback we're going to get there. But I will say that from a watershed perspective, all watersheds in BC are part of the watershed security strategy. And we're going to try to make these strategies work together anyway. So I wouldn't worry too much about being in or out. I would worry a bit about what do we actually want to achieve? And then these just become tools to do that. I do think we've looked at the watershed security strategy and how to mandate that. I think one of the gifts it's going to bring us is it'll be an enabler or a support for a lot of other things we want to do, whether that's land use planning or some of the marine area planning partnerships we've done. It'll be able to bring some foundational investments in, which will really support those other things, but also bring water more front and center into those planning decisions.
Awesome. Okay, so I have two questions left. One from Ruby. Do you think engaging with forestry to secure a strategy would be a collaborative and more productive strategy? If they were to partner with DFO, they could be contributing to this strategy to fix problems that they've created.
Yeah. So my colleagues in forestry, they will be part of this work on watersheds. There are some other, I talked about some of the key issues that we're integrating. There is kind of another suite of files that we're watching. So we're very engaged with the work on old growth, which is one component of a broader paradigm shift that's being worked on in forestry. It will tackle exactly, or the intent is to try to tackle exactly those issues that you're raising. There is a forestry intentions paper that's going out, and that will work on many of these timelines. So I didn't show that as part of those key three that we've been working on, but they're definitely related and they'll be part of this process. And likewise, we're informing how that old growth and the broader poetry reform should work as well.
Thank you. And that's all the time we have for this segment. So these questions that have not been answered, we will ask James to answer them in writing and get them back out to you. So that would be Angela and the trade-off question. We'll figure out who that is actually meant to. But thanks everyone for all your questions, and thank you, James, for being with us today. We'll now take a 10-minute break and reconvene for the First Nations Fisheries Council Executive Director, Jordan Point's presentation on FNFC Strategic Direction and 2021 Year in Review. Thank you, and see you in 10. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a chance to grab a coffee or a tea to keep you warm as we move into our next segment. First Nations Fisheries Council Executive Director Jordan Point will now share the year in review and the First Nations Fisheries Council's strategic direction with you. Jordan, over to you.
Thanks, Michelle. Appreciate all the hard work that's gone into this afternoon, and appreciate the conversation that we had with the speakers, Jody, Wilson-Raybould, and with the Regional Director General, and also with James Mack. I really appreciate the conversation and the tone of the conversation moving forward. I'm quite pleased with the conversation, the interactiveness with the question and answers. So I'm just interested in moving forward and providing just a bit of an overview of what we've been doing over this last year. And the environment, everybody knows that we've all been in this COVID environment. And of course, trying to move forward with ongoing activities in this environment has been a bit tricky. It's been a bit daunting, and Zoom fatigue is a real thing. And we're very pleased with the progress that we're making. And so I want to just move forward today and just kind of give a little bit of a glimpse into the world of the FNFC over the last year since our last virtual assembly. Michelle, you and I were here last year and doing this, so we're just going to be good at it, and we'll have to go back to real meetings. So looking forward to that. If they can put people in a Canucks game, 17,000 people, I think pretty soon we can get back to in-person meetings. So looking forward to that time, and look forward to seeing faces for a couple of the segments that you'll see later on in the program. We actually had people in person available to film the presentations. So I'm going to go through the slides and advance the slides and give a little bit of a conversation. So you've heard some of the conversation today talking about, and it was perfect, the language that Jody used with us, and we reflected back on the mandate of the Fisheries Council and the All Chiefs Task Force report, which really indicated that direction about developing a coherent and cohesive message to government and to avoid a fragmented voice. That All Chiefs Task Force report was commissioned by the Chiefs in Assembly in 2010, and it really indicated that First Nations at that time, they asked, how are we doing, and how are we performing? And the report indicated that we're not doing as good as we could be doing because we continue to speak in a fragmented voice. Somebody wants to talk about one issue, somebody wants to pull in a different direction. And we continue to see this moving forward, but I'm very pleased to hear the direction and the advice that we got from Jody Wilson in her recommendation about working more effectively together. I know in her book she talks about we need organizations to drive the change, and so the task force report actually indicated and directed the councils, the respective natural resource councils, to work to build structures and process that are designed to create a coherent and more cohesive voice to advance First Nations interests. So I know a lot of people are always worried about the direction of the Fisheries Council, and how we're working on developing this coherent messaging structure. But this is the mandate that we have. Many of you have seen our webpage and the First Nations Action Plan that really identifies that direction. So I wanted to make sure that that still is fundamentally the direction of our work. At its core, we convene people and we move people together as a facilitated kind of process. So I wanted to express to people, if you look in this graphic, there's two elements to it. The one on the right-hand side talks about how we convene, we bring First Nations together in BC, we elicit, number two, the stage, we listen, and we elicit what their interests are and aspirations. You saw earlier the poll that we put out that was really confirming and guiding us in how we move that conversation forward, what are the priorities. And number three, we distill that. We distill all of that information that we receive from the nations. We put it into discussion papers. We put it into action, into dialogue sessions. We present papers to government. We'll work with our joint executive processes with the province and with the feds and move that conversation forward. You know, it's complicated stuff. There's 630 nations in Canada. You know, if we're dealing with national legislative pieces, you know, that's national. It's coast to coast to coast. It's the Arctic, it's the Atlantic, it's the Pacific. So those national pieces of legislation are complicated stuff. We know that working with government can be complicated. There's many different departments. There's many different ministries at the provincial scale. And First Nations, we can be complicated. We've got hereditary, traditional, elected processes. So when you look at the next graphic next to that, at the left side, there's also the conversation that takes place at a political and policy level, but then there's the technical and operational, the fisheries management related type of conversation. And we know that we're dealing with political structures that are non-Indigenous, and we're working with political structures that are Indigenous. So in this Venn diagram, you'll see the FNFC kind of rests in that kind of like, I always call it the intersection. It's the intersection between the operational and the policy level. So I wanted to make sure that we cover this ground because, you know, in our communities, we have elections, people come and go, corporate memory gets lost, new people come in. So we have to revisit this stuff and confirm that people are understanding the role of the Fisheries Council as a regional umbrella group, and then how we gather that information and put it forward. These are some of the organizations that exist in the province. The ones that we have circled in gold, we have actually formal agreements with them to work together. We call those partnership agreements. We used to call them charters, but charters was a little bit complex, and people were concerned about liability and risk and legal advice and things like that. This is essentially just saying we agree to work together on the things that we really think that are important to work on together. So we've simplified this just to call it a partnership agreement. Our strategic objectives for this year that we've identified received direction from our council delegates and implementing the All Chiefs Task Force report is, number one, to increase our presence in Ottawa to influence decisions that are more reflective of First Nations priority and rights. That's going to be our high-level direction moving forward over this year, and will inform our strategic plan over the next 3 years. The reason that we want to do that is that we want to work together to develop collaborative partnerships, both at the Tier 1, the Tier 2, and the Tier 3 scales, with the objective to restore salmon populations. We know that it's going to take all of us working together. We also need to make sure that programs, policies, legislation ensures the priority access for First Nations people. And the one area that we really are starting to see, we heard earlier people talking about climate change. We saw a tornado of all things just in our Musqueam territory, a tornado. And so climate change is real. So we really need to start thinking about safeguarding our habitats and responding to threats This is theme 3 of our action plan. It's an area that we really have started to turn our focus to moving forward this year. We're going to be developing another area of management, a management unit within our operations, and we're going to call it the Habitat and Environmental Protection Unit, and we'll be developing that structure. We'll also be developing a policy group, a policy advisory group, to help us with that conversation and increasing our presence in Ottawa. Some of the specific activities of implementation towards this strategic agenda, we'll be really looking at developing an effective Tier 1 process, so building on that partnership accord that we've talked about, and then also to be working on specific areas that government has identified as part of their plans and priorities, such as the Pacific Salmon Strategic Initiative, the Oceans Protection Plan. We're working with the national headquarters on some of their policy implementation. There's a new initiative called Wave 2, which is advancing fish protection and fish habitat protection under the Fisheries Act legislative amendments. And then also you learned today from James Mack that we're really building our conversation and advancing our conversation with the province. We signed the Memorandum of Understanding with the province in 2019, but we've really started to move our conversation forward with different ministries with the province, and are really quite pleased with the conversation and the engagement with the province. They've never, as James indicated, they've never really done a one-window kind of shop where multiple ministries work with First Nations. And we were advising them that, in terms of bench strength, many nations don't have the ability to go to multiple meetings on multiple issues at a federal and a provincial scale. So the more effective we can do work towards building more effective and efficient processes, all the better, and maximizing the way that we do business. So the province has really heard that, and we're really moving forward with that. You heard the priorities that the province is looking at on implementing habitat and restoration issues, our Water for Fish initiative, and water security and management, and the coastal and marine management that lies ahead of us. Our year in review, specifically, as I indicated, this year we really had to look at making some major adjustments to our office protocol. We did renovations, we created social distancing space, we started alternating staff rotations through our office. We also were able to really expand on some of our partnership accord. We've developed partnerships accords with the Pacific Salmon Commission's First Nations Caucus. We've been working with other non-governmental organizations. We're developing relationships with some of the academic institutions. We continue also to coordinate with the provincial ministries that I just indicated on the DRIPA, the Declaration Act, and the Water Caucus conversation. We're hoping to launch very soon our new strategic plan and a new look website to make it more effective for and updated to the work that we're doing. We're also really focused on helping to develop a large First Nation strategy that's looking forward in terms of how are we going to respond to this tragic decline of Pacific salmon. We know that it's been decades in the making. It's not a simple issue. There's not one singular cause, and we know that there's not going to be one singular solution. So we really got to think and map out how we're all going to be working on addressing this decline, how we're working with the federal government on its Pacific Salmon Strategic Initiative, how we work with the province on its BC salmon strategy. We've been approached by the Pacific Salmon Foundation and partnering on some salmon dialogues that involve broader participation from many different fronts. So those are going to be some of the highlights that we're going to be working on to advise you all out there watching. We've got probably 101 business lines, so I can't go through everything that we do in the short time that's allotted, and I'm watching the clock tick down, and I've got 5 minutes to move this conversation forward. So needless to say, I'm just presenting you with kind of the high level highlights, of moving forward this year. Some of our adjustments that we continue to move forward and being mindful of you folks is I think we're probably going to start trying to implement some limited in-person meetings to kind of get away from some of the meeting fatigue that we've been seeing in terms of like back-to-back meetings in Zoom. We're going to try to develop a new hybrid of moving forward with remote and in-person operations. We've changed our process in meeting with government, and we're really looking forward to transition towards gradual in-person meetings next year in 2022. And I know we had, as I indicated, we filmed a panel last week that you'll see in a presentation later today. And people were it just energized people differently to be in the room together talking to people and in person. And it's a different kind of energy. And I really look forward to moving forward with that in the new year. Some of the growing and continuing partnerships that we have, of course, Jansen and his team with the Policy and Fish Management Group is really moving forward with this partnership accord conversation. Please look for them to be knocking on your door as we continue to update our relationships. We're all moving forward with more complex and richer, broader conversations. So we want to update our charter process and our partnership agreement. We're going to be continuing to build with the province and DFO on our memorandum of understanding, our commitment to action accords. And we've been really moving forward in this conversation. The one that's exciting now is the merging of the First Nations Caucus of the Pacific Salmon Commission. And that really starts to move forward into an international scale. How are we informing the International Pacific Salmon Treaty? And how do we collaborate with academics and non-governmental organizations to further advance our interests? I indicated to you that our strategic plan is coming together. We'll probably launch it pretty soon. We were just moving forward in getting it ready to go to print. So our priority number one for moving forward over the next iteration of our business planning is the protection and restoration of Pacific salmon. That's going to be our number one priority. Our number two priority will be safeguarding habitat and responding to threats. That's theme 3 in our action plan, the First Nations Fisheries Action Plan, our mandate. And priority number 3 will be continuing to build on solid economic opportunities. This is we're looking at the whole value chain. This isn't just about acquiring, resources and marketing for sale. This is also value-added kind of like opportunities, using different programs of opportunity to help us to build these solid opportunities moving forward. Some of the things that we want to be moving forward specifically, and this is some of the recommendations that we presented to the First Nations Leadership Council and the Wild Salmon Steering Committee, was really, as a group, nations across the province, we need to be working collectively to protect and restore wild Pacific salmon. Some of the metrics and goals that are needed is going to be healthy and sustainable populations. We all want that. We want to ensure protection of their habitats. We've got an interesting film that we want to show you later on in terms of salmon parks. So watch for that, tweak up your ears for that. We want to be collaborating on our priorities collectively. We don't want to be pulling in different directions. The more we unite our voice, as Jody indicated to us, the stronger our voice will be. And we want to provide policy, legislative advice as appropriate, where and when. And the key implementation needs will be organizing ourselves to ensure coherent messaging and advice. So not pulling in different directions, not a bunch of different conversations, but let's all start to rally around some of the bigger pieces that we need to move forward. And developing shared ownership of that issue and collaborate on some of those specific solutions. So in terms of wrapping up here, some of the things that we're looking forward, if I look over the horizon, I indicated right at the start of our conversation that we've been directed by our council, our delegates from around the region, is we need to increase our presence in Ottawa to effectively influence decisions at all scales that are more reflective of First Nations rights and priority. So the Pacific Salmon Strategic Initiative, when it rolled out, our council was saying, why weren't we there at the table when we were developing this strategy? So we're going to start moving to that direction. Currently, this is an interesting thing, as I mentioned our policy forum. Currently, there is no open space for us to talk collectively about policy. So we're going to be really thinking about launching a policy forum that can occur, whether it's quarterly, depending on how we can resource it, how we can fund it, to really start to develop policy forum that we will develop and utilize to help us develop that unified voice. Our main message to government always is to invest in First Nations, that we want to build enduring programs, not programs that come and go, but enduring programs. We're here to stay, and we're not going anywhere. The last people that will ever be here in terms of like priority access will be our Indigenous people. So we want to build enduring programs, and we've always reminded government to invest in First Nations early and often. So looking forward over next year, you're going to be starting to hear those themes coming out from us in terms of our work plan. So I want to thank you for listening to me drone on for a little bit. I want to leave some space for people to ask some questions. I believe Michelle's going to moderate some questions. If you want to contact us, those of you that are new to our environment, here's some contact information. We look forward to working with you and advancing this conversation with you as a shared opportunity for all of us. So, Hajka and Hajsepka to all of you out there, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Jordan. We're now opening the floor to questions. Please go again to your Slido box to enter any questions you might have for Jordan. And I see Slido is well at work here already. So we have 2 questions for you, Jordan. How can First Nations organizations effectively participate while balancing between the operational and rights-based conversations?
So it's a great question. As I indicated earlier, I was talking to my staff about, in this environment of UNDRIP and reconciliation, the 10 principles, I talked to Jody about this, we see government starting to turn its attention to its obligations to consult and engage with First Nations where there's a potential to infringe. So slowly that big super tanker of government bureaucracy is hard to move. But we're starting to see government response moving towards engaging and opening those doors. So we see reconciliation framework agreements underway. We see self-government agreements underway. We're seeing engagement from both the federal and the provincial scale of the Crown. The effective participation is going to be our responsibility. We have to start figuring out structures that will help us to advance a collective voice, a coherent voice. That was the mandate that was presented to the councils about building structures that help develop a coherent voice. We indicate to everybody that rights is it's a bilateral conversation between the rights holders and the Crown. But as I indicated, there's going to be things that are broader than one particular table of negotiation. So there could be things like guardians. Guardians under legislation, under the Criminal Code, under the Fisheries Act, that peace officer authority is a national kind of like objective that everybody across the country is looking for clarity on, whether you're in the Atlantic or the Arctic or the Pacific. Whether we're talking about, marine, as I talked earlier, marine shipping. These things, there might be regional pilots that we can develop. But in order for us to continue to move government can't work as nimbly as working with 630 nations or 200 in BC. They want to work in some of these more efficient processes. And we've got to figure that out. We've got to figure out how best to build those structures and what works for us. If we want to develop maybe regional structures and, how does that work? What does the governing structure look like for what can be talked about and what can't be? So in terms of like balancing the operational and rights-based conversations, that's for, the political level. You'll recall that political and policy level, that intersection. We recognize that our job is to help build discussion papers and recommendations to leadership, and we can advance them in terms of like resolutions that are well thought out, well considered, and create the mandate for us all to be working collectively to help guide federal programs in that. So I would say the rights-based conversation is strictly a bilateral conversation with the rights holders and the Crown, but there might be operational elements that we can all work on, such as, like we talked about, whether it's science, whether it's guardians, whether it's legislative amendments, those kind of things. We can all inform that conversation. So it's really about us continuing to collaborate at the operational level and then forming recommendations that everybody can adopt and advance.
Thanks, Jordan. So from Maxine, it's good to see you, Jordan. How will the First Nations Fisheries Council help the nation with nation rebuilding? I ask as I hear you mention a number of processes that the First Nations Fisheries Council has on the go, and how do we as communities keep connected?
Well, keeping connected is, we're hyper-connected. I think connections is something, and as I indicated, hopefully soon in the new year, we'll be able to assemble in person more effectively and more often. The nation-building conversation, that's been percolating for quite a while. There's many different viewpoints on what that actually means in terms of nations and the scope and scale of nation building. I think our role at the Fisheries Council is to help support that conversation when invited. There may be things that nations may say, we want to be involved in a certain conversation, but they might have their own table for that self-governing conversation. But they may invite us to talk about a specific issue. Maybe it's the Pacific Salmon Commission, and how do we get involved with the First Nations Caucus? How do we receive information, and how do we participate and inform that process? So that's part of the reason that we developed that memorandum of understanding with the First Nations Caucus, is to be more effectively moving some of that information back and forth. So hopefully that addresses some of your questions, Maxine.
All right, I have time for 2 more questions, it looks like. Jordan, how can First Nations focus to more effectively influence policies and decision makers to initiate movement that can be better aligned with programs and policies that reflects First Nations authority and jurisdiction?
Well, pretty high-level question there. So I think probably, I think this is something that we really need to start thinking about as a longer-term strategy. We know that First Nations enjoy under the Constitution, Section 35, the right to fish. That's identified as one of those constitutionally protected rights. The one thing that we don't necessarily have to complement that is the authority and jurisdiction under, pieces of legislation, whether it's, the Fisheries Act, or whether it's under, different pieces of regulations that are applying there. So we need to start thinking about how we would work together to advance our conversation and move forward towards assuming that jurisdiction and authority that First Nations, inherently right. The Calder decision indicated that when the settlers came, there were already First Nations legitimate authorities in place. So how do we get back to informing that conversation and advancing that conversation? The first thing is we all need to start figuring out what are the ones that we agree on, and then what are the ones that we may want to take more locally. And that's part of the thing, is developing that inventory about identifying what kind of jurisdiction and authority we want to work on together, collectively. And then what's the best way to work with existing laws of application, and whether it's the federal government or the provincial government, on what they're willing to work with us and dialogue about, or which ones that are things that political leaders need to advance. So there's conversations that we're having that government is saying, no, we're interested in moving the conversation, like say the water caucus work that we're doing, and we're talking about developing a provincial water table and then having a First Nations caucus that supports that dialogue with the province. And then it's really about how do we work on something that affects all of us as important as water, and how do we protect water? How do we ensure that there's flow needs that are applicable that are there for humans? And then how do we also make sure that there's proper water flows for fish? And we all need to be working on that together. So, and it's not just a government to government conversation. We know that taking on that responsibility, there's just the general public that we also need to be considerate of. And so we need to start thinking about how we design those structures to take information to the table, and then how we bring it back out to communities, how we seek their input, and then how we bring it back to the table again. So a lot of work going into this conversation. We've got the province to say, yep, we're committed to this conversation and we want to work on this conversation, and had some really forward-looking conversations and moving that forward. So that's just one example about that.
All right. I know we're running out of time for this segment, but Greg asks us, how can we include more grassroots people and rights holders into these conversations? And I know that's been an ongoing question coming from every organization across the country and every organization that works for First Nations, is how do we get more people involved? In 10 seconds, Jordan.
I think opening the door and making the conversation more open and enabling. We deal with this at our council table all the time. How do we make people more informed? How do they feel more engaged and open to participate? It's complicated stuff. We need to actually figure out a better way to land on a high-level issue, tell everybody it's important, make it simple to speak, and make it simple to understand. That's what I think the simplest way to move forward.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you for all your questions, and thank you, Jordan, for your update. First Nations Fishery Council direction clearly shows that we are stronger together. While there is a growing need for capacity and collaboration, we are very thankful for the ongoing partnerships and joint work between organizations. This is the real engine that drives the work for our nations and provide local perspectives and advice towards more strategic program and policies. Now let's hear more about this topic of capacity from participants from the Capacity and Collaboration panel. We're just going to take a moment to transition, and so get up and stretch, and we'll be right back with our Capacity and Collaboration Roundtable. Thank you.
You've heard me talk over the years about the FNFC mandate and the BC First Nations Action Plan. That's the mandate of the Fisheries Council given by the Chiefs in Assembly to really look at over 70 recommendations, the 6 themes that were mandated by the Chiefs for us to be looking at in specific. So we recognize that the Chiefs then, when they struck the councils, they identified a need to come back and check in with the councils to check on performance. One of the things that they developed at that time was the All Chiefs Task Force report. The All Chiefs Task Force report indicated that the nations continued to speak in a fragmented voice. So the councils were charged with building structure and process to avoid that fragmented voice and to help design a process for a coherent and cohesive message to government that would advance their interests more effectively. And so our councils, the Energy Mining Council, Forestry Council, Fisheries Council, we were charged with building structure and process to build that coherent message to government. And so we've been working for years on the structure and the process to do that. How we decided to do that, to build the capacity and collaboration amongst the nations for that coherent voice, was what we call the charter process. And it was really the essence of us working together would make our voice stronger and more effective to government in their design for programs and policy implementation. Over a period of time, governments have changed, of course, and now we're in an environment where the current government indicated that there was no relationship greater than that with First Nations. And so we moved into the element of, the new environment of reconciliation, the UNDRIP, the 10 Principles of Canada. So it was a really refresh kind of a way to move forward with the conversation. So over the last number of years, our policy and fish management team with Jansen and his team, they've been working to build this charter process. And now we've simplified it into a partnership agreement. What we want to do is hear from some of those people in the local areas that are working with those First Nations organizations to see how they've supported the conversation at the local level, how we've been working to hear their vision on how First Nations can be involved in informing the large strategic approach of government, how we can inform more effective programs and more effective policy. So we're going to move into that conversation and have a conversation with some of the panelists here. All right, afternoon everyone. I'm happy to gather with all of our subject matter experts now that we're all double vaccinated and coming out of COVID and the restrictions are coming down. We thought it would be a good time for us to meet as a panel and talk about First Nations capacity. I've long been saying to government that they need to invest in First Nations early and often. And today we're meeting with all of these subject matter experts to talk about capacity, the capacity that exists out in the local area with First Nations, and how we can kind of build that longer term collaboration and capacity amongst First Nations. I'm going to ask Lydia first to lead us off on what capacity development means to you at the First Nations Summit and in your own community.
It's good to see you all and to be here in this group. I'm thankful for the opportunity for us to be together. When it comes to First Nations capacity, I think one of the really key pieces we need to keep in front of us is the capacity to build relationships, to break down those barriers between jurisdictions that have held us back from the best decision making we can do when it comes to respecting and honoring Mother Nature and all that she has offered us. So I think when we build capacity for relationships, we break down barriers, we move towards decision making that's joint, that includes the recognition of Indigenous peoples' authorities. Not only Indigenous peoples' authorities, but traditional knowledge, ecological knowledge, champions for our territories and where our hearts are. So I just wanted to add emphasis to when we're thinking about building capacity, we have governments looking at making investments. We need to make those investments in First Nations communities right on the ground where our people are, building those work opportunities as well as that real connection to territory that our people feel. So with that, Jordan, I'm really happy to be in this panel and think about all the different ways that we are working together, the ways we're breaking down those relationships in terms of barriers and jurisdictional divides, that we work together and find those ways forward. And I think that is the capacity that we need.
Excellent, thank you. So in terms of like capacity and working, and one of our themes at the Fisheries Council is that our voice is stronger together. And the more we work together, the stronger our voice becomes in providing that coherent message to government. Eric, you mentioned earlier that you wanted to speak about what's going on in your territory. Maybe you might want to lead into some of that conversation.
Sure, thanks, Jordan. So one of the challenges we face is that a lot of our fisheries managers are aging out. They're getting older, and we need to replace them, and we need to bring up young people within our communities to take on those roles. And to make it more attractive to those young folks who might be interested in fisheries, it's really important that we bring back old ways of teaching in the communities where people feel like they're not having to go away to an institution where it's kind of cold and distant and they feel uncomfortable. So we've been partnering with one of our local colleges, North Island College, to develop our own fisheries resource management training program. and one of our nations, Ihatasat, is taking the lead on that. And we're going to be having our first intake of students next fall, and they're going to be learning Nechanic governance and Nechanic laws and Nechanic knowledge around the marine environment and the terrestrial environment. And it'll be a blend of Nechanic knowledges with Western science. And we hope that that's going to bring up a new generation of people, and that will be the capacity for the future through this program here. So.
As you know, I mean, the PICFI program was designed from the get-go, with that in mind, right? Building capacity. And it's not a perfect program. We all know that, right? I mean, it's a good effort, because it does address collaboration, right? Because the program itself is managed by a committee composed of Indigenous people as well as people from DFO, government people, and me, right? Which I lead the business development team. The business development team being a little bit of a hub, in between the nations and the PICFI program. And I think that model has proven itself. It's a good model. It's a good program to be delivered that way, but certainly needs much more, right? I mean, it needs more partnerships, it needs more collaborations, and more importantly, it needs flexibility, because things are changing. The resources, the aquatic resources that the Indigenous people depend on are changing. Right? I mean, we hear about the salmon declines, and we hear about a number of things that are impacting our nations right now. So we have to be nimble. We have to have the capacity of adapting the program to the blue economy. And I think that is the real future of what we're trying to achieve here, in bringing people together so that we can look at not only the fisheries resources, but the oceanic resources, which are vast. It's not just fish. It's not just farming fish or farming shellfish. It's many more things out there. So I think that's where this conversation could turn interesting, in pointing towards that direction.
Yeah, I think we've had a lot of focus on capacity development in our programming that we have, and under direction of our leadership of starting with the late Chief Albert Saddleman, with just said, bring the salmon back, bring the water back, and our role is within our fisheries department is to develop that science capacity to be able to implement those type of initiatives there, and so we do have our own habitat program. We've built with our own biologists for doing our own restoration programs. We also have a course now that we put on every October that other people can come in and take, and we've had other First Nations, government, and consultants take that course there in terms of habitat. For stock assessment, we've developed the capacity to be able to do our own tagging programs, have the information and informatics to be able to do our own databases and make our own analysis and decisions on that. When we look at some of the aquaculture, we do have our own facility with our own license, and we work on that for sockeye. So we've developed that expertise for sockeye restoration as having hatchery as one of the tools. And then we also have that with working with other First Nations to have that ability and work with us work with them on helping them on some of their recovery initiatives where hatchery may help, and we do have a small facilities that can be used that are economical and being able to move to each First Nations that want to actually look at that. And then as we look in terms of hydro and monitoring, we do also have our own hydrometric network and have people there that be able to start to estimate and set up environmental flows needs that we can then, with our communities, to actually set up and have a say in how flow needs are during the critical water periods and stuff there. So I think what we've done a lot is making sure we have the information and expertise to help inform our leadership's direction and helping advise them.
Amazing work. How many people are working with you now?
We have about 15 to 20 biologists work within our organization there, and about 45 to 50 people, depending on the time of year.
Biologists. Wow.
Yeah.
So Lydia, Howie brings up flow needs and that. So you've been working a little bit with the development of a water table and a water caucus to help inform the Water Sustainability Act and moving things forward. What do you think when you hear about
Well, when I
capacity?
hear that, I think that's exactly the sort of the information we need everyone to hear, because where Indigenous peoples are developing capacity, even in the context of colonial constructs and advancing traditional knowledge and ecological knowledge, notwithstanding some of the limitations that are put in place by those constructs. I think it's amazing as we look forward to more ways for us to work together, and thinking about the proposal that's been put forward and that we're working on right now in conjunction with the provincial government, with the First Nations Fisheries Council and the Water for Fish, is looking at how do we create a water caucus for First Nations and a water table for British Columbia, so that we actually have that underlying interest of water at the forefront, and look for those governance mechanisms to, as I said before, bring a number of the jurisdictions together where we can do some collaborative decision making, but also draw on the strengths of Indigenous people that have been underutilized in my mind, in terms of the safe space to bring forward traditional ecological knowledge as well. I mean, that's really critical. And when you're dealing with your own peoples doing that work, that makes all the more difference and more incentive, I think, to build that capacity internally, and recognize that, you know, we need safe spaces to bring that information forward, and there's real opportunities. And I'm just so impressed, and let's draw on those strengths.
That's that kind of capacity that I've been talking to government about for many years, about there's capacity with First Nations. What we lack is enduring program funding, regular and consistent kind of like commitment, so that we can continue to expand and build and create career paths for our young people coming up. One of the things that I've, and it's no surprise to anyone in government, that I've been saying for many years, that instead of staffing up internally, cannibalizing money internally, that we invest in First Nations capacity and we develop these career paths. We're the fastest growing demographic in Indigenous country, so we've got to build on that capacity.
I mean, similar to other groups, I mean, and I want to speak from the Upper Fraser perspective, is that we've been, for a number of years, we realized some of the challenges in the Upper Fraser, and some of that is accessing data, water quality and quantity management, stock assessment. And so we started supporting the communities by offering opportunities to get involved and establish baseline data that we could not access outside of our own group. And through that, we brought in consulting companies and whatnot, knowing that they were going to mentor young First Nations people from the Upper Fraser to lead the program themselves. And I think we've now accomplished that. We can still rely on the consulting company to provide support, but we have some young Indigenous women and from some of our communities in the Upper Fraser on the Chaco River that are going out and downloading and providing that information back to the nations, and as well as the province and DFO when it's required, and using that information to inform enhancement and other recovery objectives in the Upper Fraser.
And you said that the Upper Fraser consists of 23 nations?
The Upper Fraser consists of 23 First Nations from below Williams Lake, just above Big Bar, all the way to the headwaters. Amazing work.
Let's start to talk a little bit about the thing that is going to be on everybody's mind, is going to be the state of Pacific salmon, and the need for us to be talking collaboratively about how we are going to have a coherent conversation about moving government forward on the interests and aspirations of First Nations in terms of salmon recovery, salmon enhancement, First Nations priority access. What do we want to think about that? I'm going to go over to Sonora. She looks like she wants to say.
Yeah, I would love to talk about a BC SHRIF application and proposal that the AROMs on Vancouver Island just got approved. And we're calling it the Vancouver Island Salmon Committee. And it started out being the Vancouver Island Chinook Committee, but turned to salmon because any work we do with any species is going to affect all. So we got the 4 AROMs, IMOG, CARS, Uwathaluk, Eric's at this table today, and Atlegay, First Nation Fisheries Society, And what we're doing is we're creating a collaborative process where it's a tier 1, so it's First Nations only, where we're looking at what has worked with some First Nations on salmon rebuilding, creating rebuilding plans, coming up with strategies, looking at different variety techniques of protecting habitat, rebuilding the species, and working together. Some nations have done great work and some haven't done any work at all. So it's getting the 4 AROMs together to use our expertise to figure out what's worked, what hasn't, and where we're missing that work or where we're missing data, where we need that stock assessment work, we need to have the habitat monitoring work. It's basically utilizing our skills in coming together and pushing forward where we're empowering First Nations locally with the information that we have, or giving them direction what they need to collect, and hopefully, helping them with funding proposals. I mean, to hear about, I'll say it again, we all need more biologists, like especially on Vancouver Island. We have very limited technical support. So hearing things like, Nuchatlet, is it Nuchatlet or Ihatasat Nuchatlet? Ihatasat doing, this training is great because we need those technicians and biologists that understand Indigenous knowledge and understand Western science to be able to process this forward. And we're near the end of the first cycle of our committee. We're hoping to create rebuilding plans in all the areas on Vancouver Island. And that is because the AROM, First Nations or nations, working together for their communities.
So you bring up an interesting point, and it just triggered something in my mind. You brought up a reference to the AROMs. And so if I'm looking at Eric and I say, you may be using these programs to leverage dollars to do certain things, because I often hear First Nations in different regions talk about, well, we don't want to become an AROM. And I think there's a fear that it's going to eliminate or affect their rights. But a program is a program to access dollars, much like PICFI, it's accessing dollars. So what we do at the Fish Council is we're trying to get the nations together to say, what are your key priorities? What are the key overarching issues? And how do we make federal government or provincial programs and initiatives like the BC SHRIF, $100 million, like what are we doing? Are we making it work on our behalf? And are we working collectively to influence and shape those programs for the things that we want to do? And that's where our united and coherent voice comes together to say to government, hey, that $100 million, this is where we want it to go. That's where we need to start kind of making our voice stronger, collective. I'm going to go to Angela, because you've been listening. So now it's your chance to tell us what you think about First Nations capacity.
Thanks, Jordan. It's great to be here after a long time away from this group of people who have so much experience in different areas, and I learn a lot every time I'm with them. I work for a small AROM organization in the north, governed by 4 Tsimshian nations. And the space where we do most of our work is in informing salmon management to be more effective. And so we'll do pretty much whatever we can to provide more information into that space to make it more accurate and more helpful in terms of not over harvesting and sort of guiding sustainable fisheries in a more effective way. So the main way that we do that, we do a couple things, but we operate a recreational fishery monitoring program in the marine environment that's highly effective. We're not able to do that with DFO money because we don't have enough. So we are an AROM body. Our AROM funding creates sort of an administrative stability for us so that we can leverage other funds. And what we do is get Pacific Salmon Commission funding to pay for our fisheries monitoring projects. Our data and information that we collect in our little area allows us to provide genetic information to fishery managers, and that allows them to develop management measures that are effective in terms of controlling impacts on individual stocks. So not to go down into the rabbit hole too much, but it's complicated. We have to retain capacity year over year, but we don't have stable funding year over year. So we've been able to retain and grow this capacity to the point where we can now share it with other nations and groups that are adjacent to us in large remote areas that don't have a lot of capacity, but do have large recreational fisheries that are unmonitored right now. And so we're able to find little bits of money here and there to be able to do training So we are taking our capacity, we're sharing it with those nations and groups so that they can now operate their own programs. So I'd say like one of the key important bits of information that comes away is that genetic stock composition in the harvest. So right now we don't have the capacity to analyze our samples, but I know there are other nations and groups that are sitting here today that do have that capacity, and that is a major growth area that we see ourselves becoming involved in. So being able to take those tissue samples from salmon and scale samples from salmon that we collect from recreationally caught fish and analyze them to know exactly which population has been harvested and affected by that fishery. Really important work, and I know the Okanagan Nation Alliance has the capacity to actually analyze their own samples. We don't have that yet, but we intend to explore that. The thing though is that in terms of being able to do that type of collaboration, like we're all out wearing so many hats, doing so many things. We aren't teachers, right? We aren't trainers, we're doers. We would love to be able to train, but that's a whole other job, and it is actually a whole other funding line, right? And so I can't just call up Howie and say, hey, Howie, like, can you teach me how to construct and implement a genetic analysis program and a laboratory? It's a huge undertaking. It's like brick and mortar. It's like genetic, and scientific expertise that currently we don't have. It's a lot. It's like, so essentially we hold capacity and we're trying to maintain it despite not having secure funding year over year. And we have like a growth concept, but there's no secure funding for that type of work yet. The need for it is really obvious in terms of salmon populations that are now starting to dwindle. It's not a secret, and needing to really know exactly what fishery impacts are. We need to focus on the genetics.
Okay, so you really stimulate something that's near and dear to my heart when I listen to that kind of conversation, because I'm often talking to government about succession planning, management development, and having a strategic approach. So if I think about my CM next to me, and we're talking to our leadership about pushing government, it's about building career paths, about taking people and, when you work in government, they have EX development, they have management development. And so instead of like what we have in Indigenous country, we call it battlefield promotions. Somebody leaves or goes on and all of a sudden somebody is, hey, you're the new guy, you're the manager now. And it's often not kind of like structured in a succession planning manner. So I'm going to move to my far right. I'm going to talk to Stu a little bit about his role in the Skeena.
Thanks, Jord. Yeah, it's been an interesting conversation. It's nice to see everyone back in the same room again. And SFC's mandate is to protect the Indigenous right to fish, which is protected by the laws of our member nations. And so each of our member nations also have AFS agreements, and they have their own capacity. And so the trick for an AROM group like us is to continue to identify those needs and meet those needs, even though they're continuing to grow their capacity. So staying ahead of the curve is a lot of what we do at our organization. What we did 20 years ago has changed quite a bit because the capacity of our groups has grown that substantially. So getting into things that they don't actually have time for with their core stock assessment activities, such as water monitoring and management and temperature, flow regimes, hydroacoustics, and then the idea of a lab re-up. We did have a lab 20 years ago that went defunct, and now that Howie's made some progress in the lab world, we'd like to see some of these jobs and analysis take place within our own territory. So we've identified that as a future need, and hoping to work with Howie and other groups that already have that expertise to build that expertise within our own communities. Their capacity for the other item that we just talked about was recruitment and retention, and that has been another activity that was identified from our groups over the last little while. There's a lot of mining and camp jobs now that take up the talent that we have within our areas, And so there's a lot of times where, the Monday, we come to a Monday and people have gone for better jobs, better paying jobs, and jobs that are a lot more than seasonal. So SFC as an aggregate has seen that as a need and a shortcoming, and have started to provide technicians that are more career path oriented so that we can retain them. And then when GWA or one of our nation groups comes to a Monday and they have 5 people that didn't show up because they had good camp jobs, we have someone there that we can put into play to go into the field for them. And beyond that, it's just the bios, like everyone else mentioned. A lot of our nations, they don't have the capacity or the resources to hire the high-end bios and technicians that they need to produce the project proposals, approach these funding agents in an organized fashion, formalized fashion, with the expertise behind their proposal that'll give it merit and a % chance for success and funding. And so that's another thing that we've started to do with our SFC TC processes, is create frameworks so that we can go to these funding agents in an organized fashion, in a cohesive voice, along with government, to have priorities identified and formalized and clear to everyone around the table, including the First Nations and DFO.
Okay, so let's move the conversation forward, and I want to use the context, not speaking directly to it, but the context. The Crown has laid out an agenda for reconciliation. We got 10 principles. We've got UNDRIP and DRIPA. There's all of this work moving forward with the Crown at both federal and provincial scales. And collaboration is required to kind of like inform federal direction, policies, programs. We've got many pressures, whether it's the decline of salmon and what are we doing about that. So there may be some examples out there about how can we build on collaborative processes. How do we build best practices? How do we build models? How do we develop MOUs working with one another to inform new direction? So a couple of you were talking before we started filming about some examples. So I think, Gord, you started off and said, I think I have an example of collaboration. Maybe you can expand on that.
Thanks, Jordan. I think back to 2019 when Big Bar first happened. Nobody knew what to do about it, and a meeting was convened in Vancouver with the RDG and head of Fish and Wildlife of the province and myself, and there was a number of people in there trying to figure out how we were going to respond to it and what the structure was going to be to respond to that. And the parties that were all there recognized UNDRIP, they recognized reconciliation, and we established the tripart governance structure in response to Big Bar. And I think it's been effective. It has its challenges, but it's been effective in working together, understanding the issues and finding common ground to move forward. And literally, I would sort of joke about it, but if we're collaborating, we can move mountains. And we literally almost have done that, because we had to reconcile the issue with the passage there, and we still haven't done that. But there's also, that's transpired into a number of the different tables and technical tables that includes First Nations, the province, and DFO, and subject matter experts at those tables, all working together to find the best possible alternative or option or solution to restoring or recovering the fish or protecting the biodiversity of those fish. And so I think collaboration is a powerful thing, and I think we really need to have a look at it, and everybody needs to buy into it, and with it we can. It doesn't remove the need to consult, but it alleviates some of the time frame that we need for consultation, because we're making decisions in real time.
Well, I wouldn't mind mentioning an example of collaboration that we're doing with the Chalmeth and Haida. Is we set up something called our Oceans Dialogue Forum, because we recognize that the Haida and the Chalmeth nations have a lot of issues in common in the marine environment. So we created an agreement between our nations, between our hereditary leadership and the Council of Haida Nation, identified all the issues we wanted to talk about, set up technical groups to support those conversations, and then we bring both leadership and technical staff together to make progress on things like what's happening to our Chinook when they're getting fished up north off of Haida Gwa before they come down to us. What can Haida do to help bring our fish home? Or sea otters. We know that they were first recolonizing in West Coast Vancouver Island. Cayuga-Chekla said bore the brunt of that for quite a long time. They're starting to appear in Haida territory. So what can we share with Haida about that experience to help them as they see sea otters returning and affecting food security and so on? So that kind of nation-to-nation collaboration, it really makes us stronger then when we go to DFO and say, okay, we're not happy with how you're managing sea otters. This is how we collectively have figured out we'd like to do it, That I think it's a really powerful example of that.
Could I build on that, George? Yeah, just heard a couple of examples of technical committees that exist with First Nations groups and organizations across the province, and I just want to highlight that these tables exist all over the province, and they do a lot of good work. And keeping it technical is the trick always for all these tables, so that you don't mix technical with managers of politics talk, right? So I always thought it would be a great thing to have a clearinghouse of sort for the province, so that we could have that cohesive voice, technically speaking, to go ahead with something like maybe salmon parks, right? And we have all of our experts in all these different regions, the SFCTC, the SFNTC, all these IMOG, everyone has their own technical expertise, but we don't go anywhere to meet at a grassroots organic type of level where we can have these conversations flow out freely. I envision the ITAN kind of playing that role. And that seemed to be, of course, it's going to be hard to get away from that Fraser-centric type of assumption. There's a lot going on. There's close to the bulk of the nations are on the Fraser, right? But we really need to make time for the Skeena and the Stikine rivers and the Haida, bring all those people together and see if we can wrangle up one or two priorities as a province and get that cohesive voice going, right? So I just wanted to add that to the conversation. I know all of you guys must have examples from each of your respective technical groups to bring to the table, and I'm sure a prioritized list. We're working on a prioritized framework, and so something like that would be something that the SFC could bring, the IMOG could bring, Okanagan Nation, Upper Fraser, come to this provincial table with our top three priorities, see if we have one or two that match. And so that's just simplistic, but that's some of my visioning around this.
Would that be more like convening like a policy forum, kind of like scoping out ideas and then kind of parceling off where the technical conversation occurs versus where kind of like, hey, government wants to inform a policy or a program direction?
It's about separating technical and managers. What we're doing right now on the Skeena is really figuring out who are the managers, who are the technicians, because DFO does not play outside of those boxes, right? So this just for the crowd, this is the DFO IFMP game. The sovereign conversation happens somewhere else, but when we're playing in their box, we have to line ourselves up to them, right? Because we have technical conversations, we bring our technicians into the crowd, and sometimes our technicians are wearing the technician hat and the manager hat. So the technicians on DFO side can say, oh, well, I can't speak to your manager comments because I'm only a technician, right? And so we get caught in that same old scapegoat mechanism there where we don't know who's playing which role. So right now we're really trying to figure out, let's identify two people that are managers that sit in that, the crossroads like you speak of, in between policy and technician, and identify them as the spokespeople for the technicians, right? And then move into those conversations in that manner. But it takes a lot of work, right? You gotta have people that can be authorized to do that, and then have to be able to be technically sound enough to take the advice and present it to the politicians in a way that makes sense and leads to decisions that favor us.
So a quick question, do you find that having like some kind of formal arrangement with other groups, has that been helping people work together collaboratively, organization to organization?
Thank you. I'm just really intrigued by the conversation, and so many things are going on in my mind when I hear the good work that's going on around different territories and with different peoples. I just wanted to make a short comment in terms of the existence of UNDRIP and the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People Act here in British Columbia, and what that means for helping us move towards a more collaborative framework. I think that when we're talking about recognition of Indigenous rights and jurisdiction, that means we've got a fundamentally different decision-making framework in place. That we're talking about collaborative planning, we're talking about collaborative decision-making, we're talking about collaborative program design if we're going to keep talking about programs. It's taking it to the next level in terms of getting Indigenous voice at the front end, early and often, as you're a cop, but right at the front end, because there's a missed opportunity when the Crown, I think, doesn't take that opportunity at the front end to engage with Indigenous people. So I just think the human rights framework with DRIPA leverages the Crown to move towards the recognition of Indigenous peoples in a way that we're going to foster more space for collaboration, because that is a natural space for Indigenous peoples in a lot of ways. So I just wanted to add that. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Angela, you were...
Yeah, just picking up on Stu's comments regarding the local technical processes that bring all of these community members, First Nation program staff together who have there's a huge amount of diversity between the groups, but within the staff members and the technicians and the people that show up to those tables, there's a huge diversity in capacity, in backgrounds, in just sort of knowledge and types of knowledge. And so the collaborative process at Tier 1 has given a space and a time for all of those different types of information to be shared in both directions. So it's not just about one side learning, how to speak white man science language. It's about all of that sort of intermingling and informing each other so that the group then can develop a cohesive voice. It's coming to that voice that can be efficiently used when we come to Tier 2. And so, we've been really effective in the SKENA with the SKENA First Nations Technical Committee, with our ARAM bodies coming together, individual nations, all these different capacities and backgrounds, and being able to hash through some of the information that DFO puts out to figure out where all the gaps are, what we can do to fill the gaps, sort of what the information really means and what it doesn't mean. It's been very useful to have that time and space, but not having solid funding year over year is a problem, because we're always kind of wondering, are we going to have the space to do this again next year? And if you ask DFO, they will say our ability to engage effectively has increased hugely since that process was funded.
I was,
I got two hands.
oh yeah.
You go
Well, no,
first.
I was just going to say, I think from a cohesive voice that you mentioned and through UNDRIP and stuff, is just to make sure government is not, because I do see as First Nations get more capacity that the government gets almost scared of that capacity, because then First Nations are able to wanting to do what they want to do, opposed to what DFO or government wants to do on their own, and they will not always agree on that. And I think if there's one thing that can be done is to make sure government knows that, almost feel comfortable or have to move forward on that, and that recognize there will be instances that it won't fit within their current policies and programs, because it's moving towards UNDRIP of doing what First Nations want to do and stuff there. And that's, I think, the role we've taken on a technical level is how do we work with other First Nations on that, either via an MOU or that type of agreement on there, that where we do are, say, working down south in Lake Cle Elum and Yakima country kind of stuff there, or if we're being down on say down on the Skagit River type of thing there for working with the tribes down there, or down on the Lower Fraser, or in the Broughton Archipelago kind of stuff. So I think having those kind of arrangements to allow First Nations to work together in a Tier 1 environment, but then really making sure government feel almost they need to move forward on letting First Nations develop their own capacity and doing what they want to do. So, yeah, that'd be a good cohesive voice to have change on that. So,
Excellent, thank you. Sonora, you had your hand up.
Yeah, it's interesting because we talk about reconciliation and collaborating together to increase our capacity. And there's also been an opportunity for us to increase the department's capacity on knowing and understanding how to work effectively with Indigenous people. And one of the things that IMOG has done, the members of the nations on the island, is for the last 5 years, we've been creating relationship and reconciliation workshops. starting at base fundamental knowledge of the history, of cultural genocide, the impacts, working with government agents. And then we've moved into how to be leaders together, how to have effective conversations. And then the most recently we developed a program called Decolonizing Practices, where we're looking at decolonizing our mindsets, working with the department to create a really effective space for engagement. Because as much as we do this hard work, especially at those technical tables, informing our politicians and our leaders to make those joint management decisions with the department, if the department doesn't have its ears open and its hearts open, they won't be able to receive it effectively. So that's something IMOG's been doing to try to increase that collaboration and capacity with each other.
Response to Howie's observation, and I guess sort of it's one of those things that, I mean, we can't be afraid of it anymore. And I'm not talking about the royal we. I'm talking about, and I mean DFO as well, and First Nations in the Upper Fraser, in response to the dire situation that they've been faced with declining stocks, no stocks, and all the impacts that those fish have faced in the last few years, have determined that, and as Howie pointed out, they're going to go and start doing things on their own. But they also recognize that they can't do everything on their own. We don't have the capacity that we talked about earlier and stuff like that. But they have gone out and invited DFO to collaborate on some of the initiatives that they've been promoting, and some of it that's enhancement and whatnot. And you know what? The department's at the table, and I think it's effective, and we're working within the regime and policy and whatnot. But we're also working to change that policy for the future.
Thank you, everybody. There's been so much to talk about, and I know that we could talk a lot more about all of this, and even recognizing that there's people that even have more to contribute that aren't even here that we're missing. I'm thinking about, Lower Fraser, and I'm thinking about the Secwepemc, and I'm thinking about some of the other groups that aren't here at the table right now just because of logistics. And we could keep talking about this more and more, but at some point we're going to have to kind of close this session off and then go back to the forum and back to Michelle.
Thank you for a wonderful discussion. This concludes our first day of the 2001 First Nations Fisheries Council Fall Assembly. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll continue tomorrow at 1 p.m. with the day focused on strategic approaches to Pacific salmon. Again, Claco, and see you tomorrow at 1.